Kelly is a first year assistant professor here in the geology department, so it's great to have you and welcome. And come tell us about yourself and your research.
Okay, so I'm going to give the same talk in the geology sciences department seminar this afternoon, so you can come hear it again. I'm sure it's exciting enough that most of you will. But they asked me to send Matt asked me to send a bio to him this morning for that talk, and he said it should contain something fun, because the students don't like to hear your life story. So basically the bio is this. We're trying to teach computers how to be scientists. That's basically the goal of what we're doing here. I hope a little of that comes through, but mostly what I want to get through in this talk is, put it this way, the sort of types of work that I'd like to do in collaboration with the Water Center and with the National Water Model. So that's one of the main things, exciting, I mean, that's why we're all here. So I'm trying to make that connection. I hope it comes through in the talk. Let me know. Okay, so basically everybody knows what a hydrology model is. Usually we have a few slides that go through that, but I'd just like to give you a little bit of a historical perspective on evaluating hydrology models. So this is a really interesting paper from 1998, and it was the first time that I'm aware of that a machine learning model, a data mining model, actually beat a hydrology model in a well-calibrated setting. This was by Colin Hsu, who's now at UC Irvine, working with Suresh Sharushian. And I don't expect you to see these numbers up here, but the basic point is that a neural network model just really drastically beat the Sacramento soil moisture accounting model in a well-calibrated catchment. So these were things like Leaf River and other USDA catchments where we have a lot of experience calibrating models. Okay, so that was 98. This is 2015. The way that hydrology modeling is moving is we're moving toward a more comprehensive process-based simulation of the terrestrial hydrosphere and biosphere. And so 2 years ago, Martin Best, who's at the UK Met Office, I guess 3 years ago now, decided he wanted to run a model intercomparison project between all of the institutional land surface models, and he wanted to compare them against linear regressions. And I'll get to that in a minute, but basically all of these land surface models are used as the lower boundary condition for the weather forecasting, the weather forecast that you get in most places in the world. So we're talking about C.H. Tessel and ISPA from ECMWF and France, and we're talking about Jules from the UK Met Office, and Cable from the Australian Access, and NOAA, Mosaic from NASA, NOAA from NOAA, and so forth. So these are all the big models. And basically what Martin did, and there was a whole bunch of people on this paper, it was like a 30-author paper. Anyway, what Martin did was measured the ability of these models to partition surface net radiation incident surface radiation into sensible and latent heat fluxes at a half-hourly time step, which is the nominal time resolution or close to it of a lot of these models. And so what we're looking at is the ability to predict half-hourly sensible heat, and this should say QE, which is latent heat over here. So this is the Cable model. Cable is the Australian land surface model in Access. And the energy partitioning is evaluated at 20 different FluxNet sites distributed across different ecoclimates. And basically these models, the physics model or the process-based model, is ranked against a 1-variable regression, a 2-variable regression, a 3-variable regression, and a couple of very simplified models of Manabi Bucket and Pinman Monteith. So these things are ranked in terms of a bunch of different skill score metrics, but the one I'm going to show you is just the RMSE. So the lower ranking is better, meaning that if you're ranked number 1, that means that you were the best out of all of these models, the physics model and all the regression models at all of the sites. Okay, so lower is better. The physics model is this purple, these purple dots here. This is sensible heat, this is latent heat. And the regression models and the other sort of simplified process models are in different colors. And what we see is that the regression model, it's possible to build a very simplified regression model that beats all of our best land surface models consistently across all different ecoclimates in the world. And so that means, so this green line here is a 3-variable piecewise linear regression trained out of sample with no state memory, meaning it has no understanding of time, it has no understanding of mass or energy storage, it has no understanding of the interactions between hydrology and surface energy partitioning, and it's beating all of our best models. And you'll see also that some of these other models are beat by even simpler regressions. But the point is that if we're using physics to simulate the hydrosphere and the biosphere, we should probably be beating our ability to draw a straight line on a piece of paper.
Great. So what is the time scale then? This is like the long-term average?
Half hourly.
Half hourly.
Yeah. Okay. So this is, we took that and we just asked, well, how much better can we do using out-of-sample regression models against the physics models? And so we trained a neural network. We trained it using lagged input data to sort of emulate the fact that the state space models have access to boundary conditions through time. And we compared a whole bunch of these models against all of the physics models that I just showed you. So this is QE, this is QH, and we also did net ecosystem exchange, which is measured at the FluxNet sites, so we threw that in there. Net ecosystem exchange was only simulated by three or four of the models, but anyway, it's on there. These are 4 different sort of objective functions against a neural network, and these are the same objective functions against the models. And what we're seeing here is that the neural network is able to extract twice as much information from the boundary conditions as our best physics models. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of information in our field data, even a tiny sample of field data that is not made its way into our ability to dynamically simulate the hydrosphere. Okay? And this is kind of interesting. We train models at individual points, regression models at individual points, and then we trained a single regression model at all the points. And this lets you sort of partition which components of the signal, which fraction of the signal in the dynamics comes from globally stationary patterns of behavior versus site-specific patterns of behavior. And this gives you some idea of whether you could use a single physics model with different parameters to capture the local behavior of different sites. And it turns out, I'm not going to go through this chart, but the message is that about 50% of the dynamics, of the information content of the dynamics that we're observing at FluxNet sites is globally stationary, and about 50% is site-specific. Okay. So this is the question. We have a lot of data. We have a huge amount of earth science data. It's coming from satellites and extensive field studies, both with breadth and depth. So the CZOs, the NSF CZOs are a great example of concerted field efforts that have a lot of depth at a few sites, and the FluxNet is a great example of concerted field campaigns that have just a few number of variables, but at a lot of sites. We have remote sensing data, and we know that we have a lot of information in that data that could be used to help improve our models. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, in order to understand how we bring that information into our models to improve the models, we have to kind of understand what a simulation model is. And I'm going to give that to you from a systems perspective, because it's sort of in my mind, it's easier to conceptualize that way. And basically, all of our models draw a boundary around some component of the hydrosphere or biosphere. The boundary there's some prescribed boundary conditions. They solve some set of partial differential equations to estimate estimate the state based on the fluxes across the boundary, and then there's some prognostic variables which may be fluxes that are outward from the storage state. And there may be other types of things, like leaf area index is not necessarily a flux, but many of these models compute it as a diagnostic variable. So we have prognostic variables are the states. These are the things that evolve over time according to our partial differential equation. We have boundary conditions for the partial differential equations, and we have things that are predicted from the states. Okay? So those are the components of the model. There's a model structure. This is the set of equations that we use to describe the time evolution of the state. And there are model parameters. And model parameters are, again, these objects. They're components of the model structure that we allow to be flexible to describe differences in process behavior at different sites. Okay. And so what we really want here is not just a partial differential equation, but we want a stochastic differential equation. And the reason for that is that there's large uncertainties. Every time we draw a box around a piece of a watershed or a piece of the world, we assume some sort of homogeneity or some sort of describable heterogeneity in the box. So we're making strong assumptions, and that's inherent in any sort of PDE view of the world. Okay? You can't really get away from that. So we're making a whole bunch of homogeneity assumptions, and we may go in and prescribe some heterogeneity to some of these assumptions, so different processes link different mass and energy stores in the system, but all things told, we're drawing boxes around pieces of the world, so there's some inherent uncertainty. These physics equations are not law, they're descriptions, and they're always wrong, and so we have to have a random component. So what we need to do is we need to get the information from our observation data into equations like this, okay? And we know how to do that. The way to do that is well known and non-controversial. It's to use Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is the only inference tool that human beings have, and so we use it. So Bayes' theorem says, well, you have all these parts of the model that you want to estimate: the structure, the boundary conditions, the parameters, the states, and the outputs of the model, and you want to estimate them conditional on data. You just use a chain rule expansion of this probability density function. Again, the probabilities come from the fact that we're solving a stochastic partial differential equation, and you have the ability to estimate each of these parts sort of in sequence. So the outputs of the model are conditional on all the other components of the model. The states of the model are conditional on all the components of the model except the outputs. The parameters are conditional on all of the components of the model that don't change in time. So the boundary conditions do change in time, but they are prescribed from outside. The model structure, and then the data. And then the model structure could be estimated from boundary conditions and observation data. And then the boundary conditions themselves are pieces of data that you feed in that have their own uncertainties, and you can estimate those uncertainties based on other types of field data. So this orange thing here is uncertainty quantification, okay? Uncertainty segregation. The blue part here is structural estimation. That's called system identification. The purple part here is parameter estimation. The green part is data assimilation, and the red part is just uncertainty propagation. And so you go to the hydrology literature and you find hundreds of papers on each of these subjects. We know how to do all of these things. Okay. And then this paper that put them all together is from Yu-Chong Liu in 2007. Just showed how you put all these pieces of the puzzle together into a single chain rule expansion. Okay. So this is what I want to do. I mean, this is really one of the reasons I'm here, to put it bluntly, is that I wanted to take an important and big model that makes that provides input into decisions that society relies on, and I want to try to apply these techniques that we have a fairly good understanding of to help improve the model. And I want to use that to do that using all of the kinds of different types of observation data that we have available. So let's go through some of the particular challenges and approaches that we might use to do that. Okay. So starting with the National Weather Service river forecasting system, which was what exists and existed before the National Water Model, we basically have these three components. Obviously, there are people in the room that know more about this than me, but the point's fairly simple. Here you have the operational forecast system. You have ensemble stream flow prediction, which is what I called uncertainty propagation a minute ago, and we have a calibration system. And so right now I'd like to talk about parameter estimation. We're on the parameter estimation part of the problem. And the reason I want to start there is that this is probably the most widely used way to bring data in to improve a model. It's used in the river forecasting system. It's one of the major components of the existing river forecasting system. And the first time that automatic parameter estimation was ever performed successfully in a hydrology model was in 1992. That was Qingyang Duan and his shuffled complex evolution method to calibrate the Sacramento soil moisture accounting model. So this is from a paper called Effective and Efficient Global Optimization of Conceptual Hydrology Model. And this was the first time that someone had ever been able to sit down and prescribe some parameters to a hydrology model, use artificial data so they knew the exact parameters for the model beforehand, and then get an automatic calibration scheme where you're looking to maximize some likelihood or some objective function to return true parameter values. And the reason that it was difficult to do before this is just that the response surfaces of a hydrology model are quite complex. They have deep valleys, they have high energy areas, and so there's really, this paper goes through 7 characteristics of hydrological model response surfaces that make them difficult to calibrate. But we know how to do that, and we've known how to do that for 25 years now. The problem with calibrating hydrology models is that it's very, very expensive. So this is a graph from the same paper showing that it takes about, order 10 to the third model simulations in order to get semi-reliable estimates of model parameters. This is the shuffled complex evolution method that was successful, and this is another method that they were comparing it against that was successful, but only with an order of magnitude more parameter values. And anyway, this one isn't always successful, but that's, you can go read the paper. So the point is you have to run the model 3,000 times, and we can't run a model like the National Water Model or any distributed land surface model 3,000 times. There's order 10 to the 5th grid boxes just over CONUS, and that's at 1/8 degree. So you're going to be running the thing for hundreds of thousands of years to calibrate it using something that requires that many model iterations. Okay. So what do we do instead? We use surrogate optimization. And what surrogate optimization is it's a machine learning tool to calibrate very expensive pieces of computer code. This was first introduced by Tony O'Hagan at, I always get it wrong, he's either at Bristol or at Aston, but anyway, Tony O'Hagan had a couple of research grants called Managing Uncertainty in Complex Models back in the 90s and the 2000s, and they were the largest statistics grants ever awarded by the British government, basic statistics grants. And what came out of those grants was a set of procedures called Gaussian processes, or Gaussian process regressions, okay? And so if you ever use Gaussian processes, they're one of the most common machine learning tools. They came from Tony O'Hagan's work, and the very first paper that came out of that work was how to do this, okay? So basically what happens is you train a very, very cheap statistical model to give you the same response as your expensive hydrology model. You can't do it exactly, but you can do it approximately. Okay, so you take some data, you run your model at a few points, and so before you run your model, the machine learning model says, well, there's some function of inputs related to outputs, and we don't know what that function is, so we just have some variance. We're going to say it's a zero mean function just because we know nothing about it. We prescribe unit variance around it, and then we could just draw any curve in here, and we can estimate the probability of that curve based on the probability distribution implied by a zero mean unit variance normal distribution here. Okay, and this is a function that relates inputs to outputs. Now we can go run the model that we want to emulate. We run it for a particular set of inputs, and it gives us some outputs, and those are the little X's or crosses here on the thing. And then we constrain the function space based on the requirement to pass through these points. And if we're using observation data rather than simulated data, these points can have some uncertainty around them. And so you get sort of a constrained uncertainty in the function space of your model emulator. Okay, so you can have a surrogate model. It gives you some wrong objective function, but it generally tells you where things go up and down. And the real model may look like this. So you sample points along the emulator space that are near the minimum, and you do that in a way. You also sample points where there's maximum variance here, and so you're looking at a trade-off between the variance here and the value of the objective function. So it's the trade-off between uncertainty and minimizing that log likelihood function. And if you do this right, you're going to get most of the local or small or high energy minima here. So then this is what it looks like. So the basic, there's dozens of these procedures that are in the literature now, but the basic strategy here is you train a surrogate model, and then you hone in on that surrogate model, running the complex model as needed to increase your fidelity or resolution in the real response surface. And eventually you find the local minimum, and you can do it in several orders of magnitude less model iterations than you used before. So here's a very complicated model where we needed more iterations than we did over here. And here's the shuffled complex evolution method over here. That was the good one on this slide. And here's one of these surrogate model optimization techniques over here. And it's not doing quite as well, but it's doing fairly well. And it's doing it in at least an order of magnitude less model simulations. So that's how you do parameter optimization in a big model like the National Water Model. We've done a little bit of this work with the Land Information System at NASA, which is also a distributed hydrology model, but I'm not going to present any of those results because they're not that good. We did it several years ago. We didn't really know what we were doing, but this is the basic approach. Okay, so this is parameter estimation. I want to go through the rest of these. The rest of these things are far more interesting. Some of this stuff is new, and some of this stuff is the results I'll present here are some preliminary results are some of the only ones that exist. So more interesting from a technical perspective. Next, we're going to talk about data assimilation. Data assimilation is also really common. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with data assimilation, but I want to go through what it is at a conceptual level very quickly. A data assimilation is where you have a complex systems model. You have some observations, and here we're going to use remote sensing observations as our example. The complex systems model solves a state trajectory through time, and it uses an ensemble to represent uncertainty. So you have this, the model is a stochastic partial differential equation. There's some drift function, but there's some random walk associated with it, and you sample this random walk to get an ensemble of models, and that gives you some uncertainty associated with your projection at any future time. You have an observation, you move forward in real time until your satellite gives you an observation for that particular projection. That observation is associated with some uncertainty, and you just apply Bayes' theorem to merge these and come up with a new model ensemble that moves itself forward through time. And you do this over and over again. And what you're doing is you're using the observations to perturb the solution to this mass balance equation, okay? And so this is called a filter, where there's discrete steps in time, where the model trajectories are perturbed at discrete steps in time. But you can do this, and you can solve the Bayes equations in such a way that you don't get these steps. That's called a smoother. Basically, what you do is you prescribe some finite period of time, and then you move the whole trajectories according to the Bayes posterior, okay? And that becomes important in just a minute, but the point is that you're perturbing the state space solutions to the differential equation. Okay, so what's wrong with this? Well, what's wrong with this is that you only get an update when you have, at the point in time where you actually have an observation. So if you want to make predictions into the future, the information that you've projected from that observation onto the model ensemble goes away. So here's a classic example of that, and I used a Lorenz attractor, which is, something that's going to lose information from the initial conditions very quickly. So this is a little bit exaggerated, but the point is nonetheless true for all data assimilation problems. Basically, if this is the current time in real life, and we have observations up to the current time, you can perform data assimilation to get an estimate of the model state trajectory that's fairly robust up until the current time. But then at the current time, the uncertainty, or in this case, the chaotic properties of the system are going to take over, and you're going to have wide uncertainty bounds. So you lose all of the problem with data assimilation is that you lose all of the information that you've extracted from your observations as soon as the observation goes away. You take that information out, you correct the dynamic component of the model, but you don't correct any portion of the model that's actually doing the calculations, okay? So that's the problem with data assimilation. So data assimilation is really, really easy to apply to large-scale hydrological models. This is one of the most sort of routine ways to use remote sensing data, especially terrestrial hydrology-related remote sensing data, is through data assimilation with the ensemble Kalman filter. There are thousands of papers that show examples of this, but it has a major flaw, and the major flaw is that you're not actually learning what's wrong with your model by performing data assimilation. So we're going to fix that problem, okay? Here we're talking about estimating the model structure given data, okay? So we've already performed parameter estimation. We have some prescribed boundary conditions we'll talk about more later. But here we want to update the model structure so that we don't get this type of pattern when we assimilate data. We want to use observation data to update the model structure. So here's the problem. Here's the major challenge with that, okay? The challenge is that our models are quite complex. So here's a picture of a modern land surface model. This is the SUMA model coming out of NCAR. It's the structure for unifying multiple modeling alternatives. And this one is probably the most complex land surface model there is right now, but nonetheless, we're going to use it to make a point about complexity. At the center of this model is a numerical solver. So this is a collection of implicit and explicit numerical numerical routines. The state space here contains both mass and energy variables, canopy temperature, canopy water storage, snow water storage, soil water content, on and on, aquifer and soil temperature. And those states are the ones that your differential solvers are going to be acting on, okay? But the fluxes into and out of these state boundaries, this thing is divided up into hydrologic response units and then larger grouped response units. So the fluxes across the boundaries of those hydrological units are given by semi-empirical equations. So here's canopy evaporation. So we don't actually resolve a differential equation about what happens about water flow in the plant or in the leaf. We use some sort of semi-empirical equation to estimate the flux based on the canopy storage and all the other factors that contribute to transpiration. And we have canopy interception, liquid drainage, snow melting, snow unloading, horizontal redistribution, vertical redistribution. So all these fluxes are based largely on semi-empirical equations, sometimes on very, very coarse, like vertical redistribution is sometimes based on very, very coarse approximations of transport equation in the soil, but most of the rest is not. So the problem, though, is that we don't observe variables directly related. We don't have observations that are directly related to all of these variables. We only have a few observations, especially from remote sensing data. So we only have things like soil moisture, canopy greenness, like leaf area index, these sorts of things. So you can't actually go in to the model and evaluate whether it's gotten this particular horizontal redistribution function correct. We just don't have data at the scales these models are applied to do that. So we have to take the data that we do have and we have to project it onto the components of the model where it belongs without actually affecting, our mass balances. That's the challenge here. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to get to that, but I need to tell you how we're going to quantify the problem first, otherwise the solution doesn't make any sense. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to turn one of these big conceptual models, this is a conceptual model of the land surface, partly turned into a physics-based or process-based model. We're going to turn one that involves connections between lots of variables. So we're going to turn that big process-based model into a Bayesian network. Okay? And the reason we're going to turn it into a Bayesian network is now we can quantify the information transfers between each variable within the model at a particular time and space scale. Okay, so if you treat it as a Bayesian network, so in the model simulation, one variable, say QE, latent heat flux, is determined completely by the computations that are going on inside the model. So from the perspective of the model overall, none of the variables in the model are random variables, right? But if you condition QE on just one other variable, say soil moisture, now all of a sudden QE is a random variable because it's not informed completely by soil moisture, it's informed by other things. So there's some randomness associated with QE given that you only know, say, for example, soil moisture. So if you turn the model, which is a completely deterministic system, into a Bayes network, you get the ability to act on these partially conditioned probability distributions, and what that lets you do is quantify information flow between the variables. So I can say how much of the variability in this deterministic QE value is due to variability in the soil moisture value across a particular time and space scale, and I can measure how the model transfers information inside of itself, and you can make plots like this. So these are around the edges, I'm not going to go through them, but around the edges are the different variables simulated by the models, and they're pushing information to other variables, and this thing is, let's say, at a half-hourly time scale. I don't remember what this plot is exactly, but the point is you make these plots at a particular time and space scale. Now you go out into the field and you make the plot for the model, and then you go out in the field and you make the same plot using your field data, and you see there are differences. So these are real data from the Howard Creek FluxNet Tower in Darwin, Australia. And so this is really running NOAA-MP that's well calibrated there. NOAA-MP is one of NCAR's main land surface models. And here's FluxNet data from that same site. And you can see that the patterns of information transfer between these two sets of variables, the simulated versus the observed, are completely different. You can take the differences between those two plots, and you can see where the model overestimates couplings between variables, and this is at a seasonal time scale here, overestimates couplings between variables, and where the model underestimates couplings between variables. I got it wrong. This is underestimates, and this is overestimates, and these are incorrect. So this is where the model underestimates couplings between variables, and this is where the model overestimates couplings. And if you were to look at the little tiny labels on these plots, what you would see is that QE is not Sorry, I got my labels wrong, now I got myself screwed up. But what happens is, so this has got to be overestimated, because QE is too heavily affected by soil moisture and net radiation. Anyway, I'm really sorry I screwed that all up. But the point is that what we see in this particular analysis is that the plant growth component of NOAMP is detached from the hydrology and energy components of NOAMP. So NOAMP is a particularly interesting model because it's one of the first models that has both a very, very physics-based hydrology component and also grows vegetation by itself. So it has a whole carbon cycle in it. It pushes the carbons up to the leaves and to the stems. And so NOAMP is really sort of a step change in what large-scale land modeling capabilities look like, in that it grows vegetation. And what we're seeing here is that the latent heat flux, which is largely a product of transpiration, is highly decoupled from both the water and the energy cycle. Okay, so it's growing plants, but it's not doing a very good job of it. Okay, so we can take all of those models from the institutional models that we looked at on the second slide, and we can plot them on plots like this, where the y-axis on each of these plots, all of these plots here, the y-axis is some measure of accuracy in its prediction, in the model's predictions, and the x-axis is the difference in a particular information transfer pathway as compared to FluxNet data. Now, we've calculated these statistics at all 20 FluxNet sites that we've been using so far, and we calculated them for all of the models that we've been talking about, okay? So this is air temperature. These 4 plots here are air temperature moving to latent heat and sensible heat, air temperature moving to latent heat and sensible heat. This is the pathway of net radiation to latent heat and sensible heat, the pathway of net radiation to latent heat and sensible heat. This is the pathway of net ecosystem exchange to latent heat, which is something about how the carbon cycle couples with the water cycle, net ecosystem exchange to sensible heat, so forth and so forth. And this is soil moisture to latent heat and sensible heat, soil moisture to latent heat and sensible heat. So these plots are the same as these plots, just color-coded differently. Okay? So these plots are grouped by model, so the NOAA model is red, the cable models are blue, et cetera, et cetera. And here the models are grouped by FluxNet site, and FluxNet site means by different ecoclimates. And what we see is strong groupings in the site-by-site error patterns in the errors of these models. So we're comparing the ability of the model to get the right answers versus the ability of the model to correctly simulate the internal dynamics of the system. And what we see is that all of the models are basically wrong at all of the different sites for the same reasons. So there's no pattern in the wrongness of any one model according to these 2 metrics, right? But there are patterns in the wrongness of all the models at any particular site in the 2 metrics. Okay. So you would not want to take all of these models and run them as an ensemble to estimate uncertainty, because they're all getting the wrong answers for the same reasons. Okay? And this is just a clustering analysis to show quantitatively that the things are clustered. This is the fraction of various, basically something like the fraction of variance explained by clustering according to sites, and the fraction of variance explained by clustering according to model centers. That's the difference between 0 and 1. So you see that there's a reduction in variance by clustering according to sites, and not really by clustering according to models. So the point here is that these, we have a way to kind of estimate whether the models are getting the right answers for the right reasons. It's worth pointing out, just since we're sitting here and the National Water Model uses a variant of NOAA, that NOAA actually does perform worse than all the other models. Sorry about that. But the one point in here where we saw some reduction in variance according to model-specific reduction in variance is in the pathway from net radiation to latent and sensible heat flux, and really that all of that signal comes from the fact that the NOAA models are biased. We can go into more of that later, but it's really these red ones here are the NOAA family of models. We tested 3 different versions of NOAA: 2.7, 3.2, and 3.3. And this is the pathway from net radiation to latent heat flux, and you can see, so these gray ones here are Penman, Monteith, and Manabi buckets. They're not really dynamic systems models at all. And you can see that NOAA has some strong biases. So these NOAA, just to be clear, are on the parameter grids that are used by GFS and CFS. So, yes, so that's how we quantify the ability of each of these individual type connections in a complex systems model whether the model is getting those connections basically right or wrong. But now we want to know how to use observation data to improve those information pathway transfers. I'm going to show you how we do that on a very simple conceptual rainfall runoff model so that the motivation and the results are clear. We have run it on NOAA-MP, and I don't think that those results are in this slide, but they're available. You can go read them if you want. Okay, so we take data assimilation. So here's a conceptual rainfall runoff model. Precipitation comes in. There's a nonlinear infiltration function to put water in the soil moisture state. There's evaporation according to some prescribed energy-related boundary condition, and then there's a set of routing functions. They're just a Nash cascade to represent subsurface routing, and a single bucket to represent surface routing. So it's just a very, very simple hydrology model. Sorry about this. Yeah. So we turn that model into a Bayesian network across one single time step. We're going to run it at a daily time scale. And we want to know how, so this is the quick flow tanks representing surface runoff, and the quick flow tank at day t-1 influences the value of the quick flow tank at day t, but that value is also influenced by the soil moisture at the previous day because some soil moisture is feeding into the quick flow tank, and it's also due to our measurements, precipitation bound and potential evaporation boundary conditions. And so all of these things are interacting across a particular time step, and here our time step is 1 day. And the only data that we've gone out in the field and collected is actually stream flow. So we want to use our stream flow data, take whatever information we can out of our stream flow data time series, and project it onto the internal structure of this model. Okay. So the way we do that is we use data assimilation and machine learning. Okay? So we take the conceptual model, we turn it into a Bayesian network, we perform data assimilation on the Bayesian network, not on the conceptual model, and then we take the state space solution from data assimilation, and which itself is a time series. Okay, this thing can be interpreted as its own differential equation. You could never write down the form of that equation, but you have all the variables that will let you estimate the form of that equation using a statistical model, which is exactly what we do. We use the same Gaussian process regression we used earlier. Here the input data are the values of all the state variables and the values of all of the boundary conditions at a particular time step. So this is a multidimensional input data space. And the output data are the values of all of the state variables and stream flow at the subsequent time step. So what we've done again is we've trained an emulator to have the same behavior as our conceptual model, but this time we've trained it not on our conceptual model, but we've trained it on the results of applying data assimilation to our model. Okay, so we've taken the information from the observations, projected it onto the state space, and trained a new predictive model. It's a statistical model now, but it's a predictive statistical model that contains, formally it uses the conceptual model as a Bayesian prior, and it updates based on the information content of the observations. And so this is where we finally get the stochastic PDE that we wanted from the beginning. Okay, so we have dx dt is equal to some drift function, and this drift function are the equations that represent the conceptual model. Okay, so this would be our regular simulation model right here. We want to add some constructive representation of uncertainty. What we get out of the Gaussian process emulator is a mean function and a variance function, because it is a Gaussian process. It has two components, a mean and a variance, right? So what we have now, if we simply just add our Gaussian process that comes out of this to the mean function that comes out of the model, we have the mean function from the model plus any patterns that the Gaussian process is able to pick up in the error patterns. So there's patterns of error by this model. The Gaussian process is effectively going in and trying to discover patterns in that error structure. It puts those patterns in the mean function, and then the variance function of the Gaussian process also contains some patterns, but mostly it's related to uncertainty. And so what you get is a new drift function in our stochastic partial differential equation representing both our original understanding of physics and anything we've learned about the way those physics systematically deviate from observed reality. And these are the results of that applied to the HiMod model. So I want you to look at this plot right here. This is where we have the HiMod model alone. We've applied, okay, so the black line is HiMod running during a time period where we have observations available. That's 3 years worth of observation data. And then we're using HiMod to make 3 years worth of predictions. We still have rainfall data at that time, but we don't have any stream flow data to go in and perform data assimilation or parameter estimation with. So we're doing a split record evaluation of our methods here. So we have the model alone. We do parameter estimation. It improves the model, and it improves the model more during the period of time where we have calibration data, less during the period of time where we don't have calibration data. We perform data assimilation. Data assimilation does a very good job during when we have data available to assimilate, but not a good job when we don't have data. But if we take that data assimilation data, the information content of the data assimilation data for the 3-year period, and we use structural estimation or system identification to improve the model structure, then that data, that information is stored in the model structure. We actually get better predictions during the period of time where we're not doing data assimilation. So it works with a simplified conceptual model. Basically what we're doing is we're changing the shape of the response surfaces that are implied by the equations in the model. So you have input data. Each of these little subplots is, 2 dimensions of the input data space across a single time step and 1 dimension of the output data space. So you're just kind of looking at collapsed projections of the full model response surface into 3 dimensions. And you're just seeing that before we perform system identification, it's a highly linear model. And after we perform system identification, we've added some nonlinearities into the way the model behaves, and lets the model act more like what we've observed in reality. We can go back and calculate the information transfers along individual pathways, and we can plot here, this is a heat map of where particular structural data assimilation has changed the way the information flows within the model. So brighter colors here, red and green, are where the patterns of information transfer between 2 particular variables has changed. So this is the pattern of information transfer from precipitation to soil moisture. That's our biggest change. Here's an example of subsurface routing, the first subsurface routing storage tank to soil moisture. So there's a feedback from the subsurface moisture content to soil moisture implied by data assimilation. But the point is that we perform data assimilation by assimilating stream flow, which lives way over here. And what the method has found is that the thing that was really going wrong with our model, or the way it found to improve the model the most, is by changing the infiltration function, which lives way over here. It's completely removed. And so we've been able to, at least to some extent, extract partial information content from partial observations and use it to update the model in relatively surprising ways. Oh, okay, and I just want to go over, just to reiterate what the goal was here. The goal is to use data assimilation to update the structure of the model without affecting the physics that lives inside here, but while updating our understanding of the sort of semi-empirical parts of the model that live out here on the periphery, and to do that in such a way where we only have indirect data about maybe 2 or 3 of these different things. And so what you can't do is you can't go in and train a machine learning model. We can go in and we can go in and train a machine learning model that does much better than these process-based models. You don't want to use those for prediction because machine learning models don't perform well in out-of-sample conditions. So if we're looking at making forecasts in new types of situations, say 500 or 1,000-year floods or under anthropogenic change, you're not going to want to rely on a machine learning model, but you also don't want to rely on a process-based model that performs worse than you could do if you were able to take all of the information from your data. So you don't want to replace the whole thing with a machine learning model, and you don't have the training data to replace each one of these little process coupling components with a machine learning model. So that's why we use data assimilation to project observations onto the interior structure of the model and then try to train on the results of that. How much time do we have left?
5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to just stop there. So I'll just point out one more thing, that we've used the same sort of sets of theory, information theory and machine learning type theory, to do uncertainty decomposition, so we can start to look at the uncertainty in both the data that we're assimilating and the boundary conditions we've prescribed to the model. And we've done that with the NLDAS model, the North American Land Data Assimilation System, and what you can do is you come up with fractions of uncertainty due to all the different components of the model, and this will help you target where, which of these different methods you should be using. So NLDAS, which is a major the major computational input to the U.S. drought monitor. So soil moisture is its most important prediction, and we're seeing that 60% of the uncertainty in soil moisture comes from parameters. So the first order improvement to the NLDAS drought monitoring system would be parameter estimation, and then about 20% comes from model structure, and about 25% from model forcing. So this, we can start to partition uncertainty to sort of help us choose which one of the strategies we talked about before to apply to a given particular forecasting problem. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah, I'm curious about your network model. So how many variables you use for the neural network model, input variable?
Yeah, so for this one, we're using somewhere between 100 and 1,000. So we've used a lot of them. So different. The problem with training a neural network to emulate a process, a physical process, is that the physical process has a memory lag. So we should be using a recurrent neural network, right? Because there's part of the output determines what's going to happen at the next time step. That's the state of the system, mass or energy storage, right? So, but we don't want to do that because we're trying to use pure regression to estimate the information content of data pairs. So what we do instead is we use a time lag of boundary conditions. Okay, so what you have to do in order to determine the length of that lag is to understand the sort of the characteristic time scales. So what we do is just a sensitivity analysis. We say, how far back do we have to go before we're getting no sensitivity to the inputs? So for every neural network that we're training, we're asking that question first, and then we're training it, and the answers range between, I don't know, probably, I mean, we've used up to 1,000, but probably in the 100 to 200 range, and then we're using 10 to the 5th training points.
Yeah, because you use multi-layer perceptron neural network is itself kind of very heuristic training. A lot of parameters you need to adjust the parameter, make sure it's optimal combination.
Yeah. So that's a good point. There's 2 points that I'll make to that, two responses. The first one is that the neural network, sort of the state of the art neural networks now are using billion-plus variable inputs. Okay? So if you're looking at the machine learning that Google's doing, they're able to get reliable predictions from billion-plus variable neural networks. So, and the way that they're doing that is using the feature learning space, so what they call deep learning, right? So we're not doing that. We're using single layer feed forward neural networks, and we're using back propagation. So we're not even using global optimization, which is what you're talking about, global optimization of parameters, right? But so these are very, very simple neural networks, right? But what we can show is that they place a lower bound on the information content of the data, and that's the key, right? So you could not make. So if the neural network makes a prediction with, say, that provides, say, 50%, explains 50% of the entropy of the observation data, that's 50% information content. So the mutual information between the ANN predictions and the observation data is something like 50% of the entropy. Okay? That means that even if your neural network is not great, you can get at least 50% of the entropy display. So you can actually turn that into a theorem. Okay, so what I just told you is itself a theorem. It's called the data processing inequality. It just says that there's no manipulation of a random variable that you can make that increases its mutual information content. Okay? And you can turn the data processing inequality into a formal hypothesis test through this theorem here. And I can go through it if you want, but I don't think I will. But the point is that that even if your neural network is not perfect, what you get is the estimator of your error is bounded above by the true error. I mean, it's just absolutely intuitive. So so when I show a plot like this, so yeah, well, I'll go back to the beginning. So when I show a plot like this here, where the process models are not performing as well as the neural networks, these bars here are lower bounds. They could be higher.
Next question, like when you use the data assimilation to get the parameter values of certain processes, so did you do it by each process wise, or did you do it like a global optimization kind of approach?
Yeah.
My question is, the parameters that you estimated can provide better solution, but it may not be the real parameters. Did you check these parameters with the ground-based observation?
So first of all, I'll just say this: the data assimilation is not estimating parameters. It's perturbing the state space solution. Okay, so the parameter estimation is estimating parameters. The data assimilation is just the model is fixed. So I'm not using data assimilation to estimate parameters. Okay, the data assimilation actually is much data assimilation can be used to estimate parameters. It's much more computationally expensive, several orders of magnitude computationally more expensive than global optimization, and that's because I mean, in both cases you're looking for the limiting distribution, but in data assimilation you're requiring the thing to walk there through a random walk. So all you're doing when you use data assimilation to estimate parameters is you're asking whether that random walk in the parameter space probabilistically improves the parameters, and you keep it if it does. Okay. So I mean, this is a big argument. So we can go through this philosophically. You can find papers in the journals that argue whether or not you should be using data assimilation for parameter estimation. But the bottom line is that data assimilation for parameter estimation is a form of simulated annealing, and it's a couple orders of magnitude more expensive than traditional global optimization. So I see no reason to use it. So what's actually happening when we do data assimilation is we're perturbing the state variables. So this is the dx/dt equation, right? So this is the form of the model structure. You can solve this, you can integrate this equation to come up for a time series solution of x, okay? And all we're doing is perturbing that time series solution directly. We're not actually perturbing the mechanisms that result in the solution, right? So down here, we're estimating x, this is Bayes' theorem here, so we're estimating x given the observation data, and there's nothing in here, there are no random variables in here are related to any of the portions of the model that are held constant. So we're not actually changing any of the parameters of the model. And that's the problem with data assimilation, right? So parameter estimation or parameter estimation with data assimilation can update those portions of the model that the model developers have decided are going to be flexible across sites. Those are the model parameters. But there's other parts of the model that can be wrong, and that's the model structure. And so what we're actually doing is using data assimilation to estimate the model structure. You have to perform parameter estimation before you're going to run data assimilation anyway. Yeah. If you don't, then you get the bias problem. So there's two ways in the data assimilation literature to take care of the bias between models and retrievals. So satellite retrievals are highly biased. Models may or may not have some bias in them, depending on how good they are. Okay, and so there's two. And so if you use the ensemble Kalman filter, the Kalman filter assumes zero mean retrieval error and zero mean model error. And if you violate that assumption, you get bad updates from the ensemble Kalman filter. So you have to force your model and retrieval to have the same climatology before you can perform data assimilation. And there's two ways to do that. One is by CDF matching, where you actually just move the cumulative density function of the retrievals down into the model climatology. And the other one is model calibration. So when I say that there are two ways to do that, that comes from a paper by Sujay Kumar from 2014 or something like that. And so my opinion is you do model calibration first, and if you're using remote sensing retrievals, you're calibrating not only the physics model, but also the retrievable parameters of the retrieval model too. And most of your update will be in the retrieval model parameters. So like when I say retrieval model, I mean whatever model the remote sensing product team uses to get their to move from brightness temperatures to some physical variable.
All right. Thank you, Greg.